I could tell something was wrong the second I opened my door to find a cluster of stern-faced people on my front porch, clipboards in hand and determination in their eyes. The woman at the front, blonde bob haircut, designer sunglasses perched atop her head, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, thrust her hand toward me. Karen Westfield, president of the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association. And you must be the new owner of this. She paused, her gaze sweeping dismissively over my modest but charming Victorian home. Interesting property. I didn't take her hand. After 12 years in the Army and another 5 building my small construction company, I had developed a decent radar for trouble. This woman was definitely trouble. Kyle Newman, I replied simply. What can I do for you folks? Karen's smile tightened as she withdrew her unshaken hand. Well, Kyle, we're here to welcome you to our community and provide you with our HOA bylaws and fee schedule. Your first quarterly assessment of $750 is due by the end of the month. I blinked. I think there's been a misunderstanding. My property isn't part of any homeowners association. Her perfectly penciled eyebrows rose. Oh, but it is. Every home in Sycamore Heights is part of our association. It's been that way for 15 years. Except mine, I countered. The real estate disclosure clearly stated this property has no HOA attachment. That was actually a selling point for me. Karen laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that set my teeth on edge. I'm afraid your realtor was mistaken. Our records show that all 98 properties in this neighborhood, including yours, fall under our jurisdiction. Behind her, a thin man with a receding hairline nodded vigorously. Our community covenants are very clear, Mr. Newman. I'd been home from my latest construction project for less than 2 days. The last thing I needed was to deal with an HOA I never agreed to join, especially one trying to extract $3,000 a year from me. Look, I've had a long week. If you could just leave whatever paperwork you have, I'll review it and get back to you. Karen's expression hardened. I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. You purchased property in our jurisdiction, so you're automatically subject to our rules and assessments. Speaking of which, her eyes narrowed as she glanced at my driveway where my work truck sat, loaded with tools and materials. Commercial vehicles aren't permitted to be parked in driveways overnight. That'll be a $100 fine for today's violation. That's when I knew this was going to get ugly. What I couldn't have known then was how deep this rabbit hole would go, or how a yellowed piece of paper from 1901, hidden in my attic, would turn this neighborhood upside down and expose decades of fraud that would ultimately land Karen Westfield in handcuffs. This is absolutely ridiculous, I muttered to myself as I rummaged through the house's original paperwork later that evening. The previous owner, an elderly widower named George, had meticulously maintained a file box of documents related to the property. I'd glanced through it during the purchasing process but hadn't done a deep dive. George had mentioned something curious during our only face-to-face meeting. This place has history, son, he'd said, his arthritic fingers tapping on the thick oak banister. It was here long before all these cookie-cutter houses sprouted up around it. Don't let them forget that. At the time, I thought he was just being nostalgic about the neighborhood's evolution. Now I wondered if there had been more to his warning. My phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed Chloe Simmons, my realtor and, fortunately, an old friend from high school. Tell me you didn't know about this HOA nightmare, I said by way of greeting. Kyle? What are you talking about? Chloe's confusion seemed genuine. I just had the neighborhood welcome wagon stop by, except instead of cookies, they brought demands for $750 in quarterly fees and a $100 fine for my work truck. That's impossible, she replied, professional confidence in her voice. I ran a complete title search. Your property is definitely not part of any HOA. Did you tell them that? They weren't exactly in a listening mood. The president, Karen something, basically told me I have no choice. Karen Westfield? Chloe's tone changed, growing noticeably colder. That woman has been causing problems all over the west side. She started with a legitimate small HOA near the park about 15 years ago, but somehow she keeps expanding her territory. Well, she's trying to expand it to include me, and I'm not having it. Look through the closing documents I gave you. There's a specific disclosure stating your property has no HOA attachments. If they keep pushing, you might need to get a lawyer involved. After we hung up, I continued my search with renewed determination. An hour later, amidst property tax records and utility connection papers, I found something unexpected, a small key taped to the back of an envelope marked simply, Attic. Curious, I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. The attic was surprisingly well organized for a space in a century-old home. In one corner sat an ancient trunk, its brass fittings tarnished with age. The key fit perfectly into its lock. Inside, I found layers of history, old photographs, letters, and at the very bottom, a leather document holder that contained what appeared to be the original property deed from 1901, bearing the name Newman Estate. I stared at the name, then at my own signature on the modern deed. A coincidence? I wasn't a believer in fate, but finding out I had purchased property that once belonged to someone sharing my surname was eerily satisfying. But what really caught my attention was the handwritten covenant attached to the deed. This land and all structures upon it shall remain free of all community encumbrances and private governance in perpetuity. No future neighborhood association, improvement society, or similar collective may claim jurisdiction over this property without the explicit written consent of the current deed holder. I read the words again, a slow smile spreading across my face. The document was clearly legible, officially notarized, and appeared to have been registered with the county. If authentic, this could be exactly what I needed to fend off Karen and her HOA minions. As I carefully returned the documents to their protective sleeve, my phone buzzed with a text message. Notice: unauthorized commercial vehicle still in driveway. Additional $100 fine assessed. Please remit payment for total $200 violation to HOA office by Friday. SHHA Management. They were watching my house. The realization sent a chill down my spine, quickly followed by a wave of anger. I'd dealt with enough bullies in my life to know one thing for certain: backing down only encourages them. Little did I know that the next morning would bring not only another confrontation with Karen but also a bizarre discovery about the true nature of her HOA's expansion throughout the neighborhood, and it all started with a knock on my door at 6:30 a.m. The insistent pounding jolted me from sleep. Pulling on a t-shirt and sweatpants, I stumbled downstairs, half expecting to find Karen and her clipboard brigade again. Instead, I found a man about my age, dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy radiating from him. "Sorry to bother you so early," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I'm Patrick from 4 houses down. Number 1842. "Kyle," I replied, stifling a yawn. "What can I do for you? I saw them here yesterday. The HOA. And I saw your truck is still in the driveway." He lowered his voice. "They're serious about those fines, man. They'll put a lien on your house if you don't pay." "They can try," I said. "My property isn't part of their association." Patrick's eyes widened. "That's what I thought 2-3 years ago when I moved in. My closing documents said no HOA. But then Karen showed up with paperwork supposedly proving my house had been annexed into Sycamore Heights HOA before I purchased it." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I fought it for a while, but after the third threatening letter from their attorney I gave up. It wasn't worth the stress. How many others are in the same situation? At least a dozen homeowners that I know of. Most of us just pay to avoid the hassle. The older section of the neighborhood was legitimately part of the HOA from the beginning, but everyone on this street and the next 2 over? We were all supposedly annexed sometime in the last decade." I invited Patrick in for coffee, and over the next half hour, he filled me in on Karen Westfield's reign of terror. The excessive fines, the selective enforcement of rules, the mysterious way HOA funds were spent. "Nobody's allowed to see the complete financial records," Patrick explained. "The board claims they're available for review, but whenever someone asks, there's always some excuse. And anyone who pushes too hard suddenly finds themselves dealing with violation notices for ridiculous things, like being fined because your grass is an inch too tall, or your mailbox paint is the wrong shade of black. That sounds illegal, I said. Patrick shrugged. Probably is, but who has the time or money to fight it? Karen's husband is a lawyer, and they make it clear they're willing to drag things out in court. Most of us just pay the stupid fees and try to stay off their radar. After Patrick left, I called into my foreman and told him I'd be taking a personal day. Something wasn't adding up, and I needed answers before Karen and her crew returned, which, based on their pattern of escalation, would likely be soon. I spent the morning researching HOA laws and regulations in our state, discovering that for a property to be annexed into an existing HOA, either the original deed had to allow for it, or the current owner had to explicitly consent in writing. Around noon, I drove to the county records office. The clerk, a friendly older woman named Doris, seemed intrigued by my questions. Sycamore Heights? She mused, typing into her computer. Yes, we have their original incorporation from 2007. Covered just 26 properties initially. She peered at the screen. But you're right, they've filed amendments over the years adding properties to their jurisdiction. Currently shows 98 parcels. I'd like to see the documentation for the addition of my address specifically, I said, providing her with my house number. Doris clicked through several screens, her brow furrowing. That's odd. Your property was added in an amendment 3 years ago, but... She clicked again. The supporting documentation is incomplete. There should be a signed consent form from the previous owner. George Wellington? He would have been in his 80s at that time. Doris nodded. The system shows a signature page was included, but when I tried to access the actual scan... She turned the monitor so I could see. File not found. Is that normal? Not at all. Every document should be properly scanned and linked. She frowned. Let me check something else. After a few more clicks, she sat back. Well, that's interesting. There have been several audit flags on Sycamore Heights filings over the years, but they were all marked as resolved by the same clerk, who no longer works here. Any way to find out what those flags were for? Not from this terminal. Those would be in our internal review notes. She gave me a measured look. You know, if someone were to file a formal request for investigation into potentially fraudulent property annexations, we'd be obligated to conduct a thorough review of all documentation. I smiled, understanding her hint. And how would someone go about filing such a request? As Doris helped me with the paperwork, my phone buzzed with a notification. An email from the Sycamore Heights HOA with the subject line. Final notice, compliance required. I opened it to find a formal letter stating that due to my continued non-compliance, a lien would be placed on my property within 48 hours unless I paid all outstanding fees and signed their membership acknowledgement. Attached was a photo of my house taken that very morning, with my truck still in the driveway, and a timestamp of 8:17 a.m., while I had been inside talking with Patrick. They were watching me. Again. But now, with the county investigation request filed and the original deeds safely photographed on my phone, I felt ready for whatever Karen Westfield might throw at me next. What I wasn't ready for was what happened when I returned home and found my property had been altered in my absence, an act that would ultimately expose just how far Karen was willing to go to maintain her control over the neighborhood. The large, garish sign had been hammered into my front lawn while I was gone. Notice of HOA violation property subject to lien. It was positioned prominently near the sidewalk, impossible for any passerby to miss. As I stood staring at this brazen invasion of my property, a silver Mercedes SUV pulled up to the curb. Karen Westfield emerged, wearing an expression that probably passed for sympathetic concern in her mind but looked more like smug satisfaction. Such a shame it had to come to this, she said, approaching with measured steps. But rules are rules, Mr. Newman. You put a sign on my property without permission, I stated flatly. That's trespassing. She waved a dismissive hand. HOA bylaws give the board authority to place violation notices as needed. Perhaps if you had bothered to read the documentation we provided, documentation that doesn't apply to my property. I interrupted, pulling out my phone. I visited the county records office today. Interesting what I found, or rather, what I didn't find. There's no valid documentation showing my property was ever legally annexed into your HOA. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across Karen's face before her composure returned. Our attorney has all the necessary paperwork. The previous owner, Mr. Wellington, signed the consent form himself. Did he? I asked, keeping my tone casual. That would be quite a trick, considering he was hospitalized with a stroke during the month this supposed annexation occurred. He couldn't even hold a pen, much less sign legal documents. That wasn't something I knew for certain, but based on the gaps Doris had shown me and some quick research on George's timeline, it seemed a reasonable guess. Judging by Karen's reaction, a slight widening of the eyes, a tightening of her jaw, I'd hit close to the mark. Our documentation is in order, Mr. Newman. If you wish to dispute it, you're welcome to take it up with our attorney. In the meantime, you have 24 hours to remit payment and remove that commercial vehicle from your property, or we'll proceed with the lien. I pulled up the photo of the 1901 deed on my phone and held it out to her. You might want to take a look at this before you go down that road. Karen barely glanced at the screen. Whatever ancient paperwork you've dug up is irrelevant. Current county records are what matter. This deed contains a specific covenant preventing this exact situation. No community association can claim jurisdiction over this property without the owner's consent. It's been properly recorded with the county since 1901. Then why isn't it reflected in current records? She challenged. That's an excellent question, I agreed. One that the county records office is now investigating, along with all the other properties your HOA has mysteriously annexed over the years. Karen's confidence visibly faltered. You've filed some sort of complaint? A formal request for investigation into potentially fraudulent property annexations, I confirmed. And based on what the clerk found in just a few minutes of searching, they're taking it very seriously. She took a step back, recalibrating. Mr. Newman, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Perhaps we can discuss this like reasonable adults. The HOA provides valuable services to maintain property values for everyone, save it. I cut her off. Remove your sign from my property immediately, or I'll call the police and report it as trespassing. Her expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Do you really want to make an enemy of the entire neighborhood? I'm not interested in enemies, Ms. Westfield. I just want to be left alone to enjoy the home I purchased, the home that legally has nothing to do with your association. Karen's phone chimed. She glanced at it, then back at me with an unsettling smile. We'll see about that. The board is convening an emergency meeting this evening to address your situation. I suggest you reconsider your position before things escalate further. As she walked away, I pulled the violation sign from my lawn, wondering what exactly she meant by escalation. I didn't have to wonder long. By nightfall, the true extent of Karen's influence over the neighborhood became evident, and so did the first hints of the financial scheme that her HOA empire was built upon. The emergency board meeting wasn't hard to find. Several cars lined the street in front of a large colonial-style house 3 blocks over, and lights blazed from what appeared to be a converted sunroom at the rear of the property. I hadn't planned to attend, hadn't even been invited, but something Patrick had said earlier stuck with me. Nobody's allowed to see the complete financial records. Combined with the irregular documentation at the county office, my suspicions were growing stronger by the hour. Instead of confronting them directly, I parked a block away and walked to a small park behind the meeting house. From there, I could see through the large windows of the sunroom, where about 15 people sat in rows facing a presentation screen. Karen stood at the front, gesturing emphatically as a slideshow displayed what appeared to be photographs. Even from this distance, I recognized my house in several shots, including close-ups of my work truck, my front porch, and even one taken through my kitchen window. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just harassment, this was stalking. They've got quite the surveillance operation going, don't they? I nearly jumped at the voice beside me. A woman had approached silently, now standing a few feet away. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and an expression of distaste as she observed the meeting. "I'm Crystal Saunders," she continued, extending her hand. "County Assessor's Office." I shook it cautiously. "Kyle Newman. Why is the county assessor interested in an HOA meeting?" She smiled thinly. "Let's just say your complaint filing today accelerated an investigation that's been quietly developing for some time. We've had concerns about property tax irregularities in this neighborhood for the past few years." "Tax irregularities?" Crystal nodded. "Several properties, including yours, are classified differently in HOA documents than they are in county tax records. The discrepancies have created some interesting patterns." Before she could elaborate, movement from the meeting caught our attention. Karen was pointing forcefully at a map of the neighborhood, with certain properties highlighted in red. My house was among them. "I can't hear what they're saying," I muttered. "I can help with that," Crystal said, pulling out her phone and opening an app. "Directional microphone. Part of our investigation toolkit." She aimed the phone toward the sunroom, and suddenly, Karen's voice came through with surprising clarity. "Must present a united front. If Newman succeeds in breaking away, others will follow. The entire structure we've built could collapse." A man's voice responded. "But if he's right about the legal status of his property, he's not," Karen interrupted sharply. "And even if there are irregularities in the documentation, it's in everyone's interest to maintain the status quo. Do you want to go back to handling your own landscaping? Paying for your own security patrols? And what about the community pool renovations we've planned?" Another voice chimed in. "I still don't understand why we can't see the detailed financial statements before approving another $200,000 for the pool project. The last renovation was just 3 years ago." Karen's voice grew noticeably tense. "As I've explained repeatedly, Trevor, the full financials contain sensitive information about payment plans for residents facing hardship. It's a privacy issue." "That doesn't make sense," the man called Trevor persisted. "You could redact names. We need to focus on the immediate threat." Karen deflected. "Newman is challenging our authority, and if he succeeds, it jeopardizes everything we've worked for. I've prepared letters for each of you to sign, affirming that his property has always been understood to be part of our association." Crystal switched off the microphone app. "Interesting. Very interesting. She wants them to lie in writing," I said. "More than that," Crystal replied. "She's hiding financial information from her own board members. Based on what we've uncovered so far, there's a good chance those pool renovations never actually happened, at least not to the tune of what was collected from homeowners." "You think she's embezzling?" Crystal gave me a measured look. "I think tomorrow morning is going to be very enlightening for everyone in Sycamore Heights. We'll be executing search warrants on the HOA office and Ms. Westfield's residence at 7 a.m. She handed me her card. "If you experience any additional harassment between now and then, call me directly. And Mr. Newman? You might want to check your mail when you get home. I have a feeling there might be something waiting for you." With that cryptic suggestion, she melted back into the darkness, leaving me to wonder what the next day would bring, and what might be in my mailbox. Crystal was right. When I returned home, I found an unmarked envelope that had been slipped through my mail slot. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. "Not everyone supports what's happening. You're not the only victim. A neighbor." The contents of that drive would provide the final pieces of evidence needed to bring down Karen Westfield's fraudulent empire. But I couldn't have anticipated how desperately she would fight to maintain control, or how personal the conflict would become when she discovered my connection to the property's original owner. I spent half the night reviewing the files on the USB drive, my shock growing with each document I opened. Whoever my anonymous benefactor was, they had access to the HOA's internal records, complete financial statements, board meeting minutes, and most damning of all, a folder labeled Annexation Documentation that contained templates for creating consent forms, along with signatures that appeared to have been cut and pasted from other documents. There were spreadsheets tracking actual versus reported expenditures showing hundreds of thousands of dollars collected for community improvements that never materialized or cost a fraction of what was charged to homeowners. The pool renovation that Karen had mentioned at the meeting? According to these records, the HOA had collected $175,000 for the project but had only paid a contractor $28,000 for minor repairs. Most disturbing were the surveillance logs, detailed records of monitoring activities targeting homeowners who had questioned HOA policies or requested financial information. My name had been added to this list just 2 days after I moved in, with a notation. Potential troublemaker independent type, check for violations aggressively. By dawn, I had organized the most incriminating files and emailed them to Crystal Saunders, along with a summary of what I'd found. Then I made coffee and waited. At precisely 6:58 a.m., my phone rang. "Mr. Newman, this is Crystal. I received your email. Those documents corroborate much of what we've suspected and add significant new evidence. Our team is in position to execute the warrants, but there's been a development you should know about." "What kind of development?" "Karen Westfield was observed loading boxes into her vehicle about an hour ago. She's currently at the HOA office, which is actually just a converted bedroom in her house, removing additional documents. We're moving in now, but I wanted to warn you that she may have seen your name on our warrant and could potentially head your way. I appreciate the heads up. One more thing," Crystal added. "That 1901 deed you showed us? Our historical property specialist confirmed its authenticity this morning. It contains what's called a restrictive covenant against community governance, apparently quite rare for that time period. The original owner must have been quite adamant about preserving the property's independence." "About that," I said, "I think there might be a connection I hadn't realized. The original deed is in the name of Newman Estate. Given that's also my last name, we noticed that coincidence." Crystal interrupted. "It's actually not uncommon for people to be drawn to properties that have some historical connection to their family, even if they aren't consciously aware of it. Our specialist is checking genealogical records to see if there might be a direct link." After we hung up, I found myself standing in the entryway, staring at the vintage photograph I'd found in the attic, a stern-looking man in early 1900s attire standing proudly in front of the newly built house. Could he be a distant relative? The thought was both unsettling and oddly comforting. My contemplation was interrupted by the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside. Through the window, I saw Karen's silver Mercedes parked haphazardly at the curb. She emerged looking considerably less polished than usual, hair disheveled, clothing rumpled, her typical composure replaced by barely contained fury as she marched toward my door. I opened it before she could knock. "Mr. Newman," she spat. "What have you done?" "Good morning, Ms. Westfield," I replied calmly. "If you're referring to the county investigation, I simply asked questions about documentation that seemed irregular. They're at my house right now with a search warrant." Her voice rose to a near shriek. "Years of building this community, of protecting property values and maintaining standards, all jeopardized because you couldn't just fall in line like everyone else. Is that what you tell yourself? That forcing people to join your HOA under false pretenses and embezzling their money is building a community?" Her eyes widened. "Embezzling? That's a serious accusation, Mr. Newman. One you'll regret making. I've seen the financial records, Karen. The real ones, not the sanitized versions you show your board. I know about the fake pool renovations, the non-existent security upgrades, the landscaping services that cost half what you collected." For a moment, she seemed genuinely confused, then understanding dawned in her eyes. "Trevor," she muttered. "That backstabbing little, it doesn't matter who provided the documents," I said. "What matters is they show a clear pattern of fraud going back years. And now the county has them too." Karen took a step closer, dropping her voice. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This neighborhood was nothing before I took control. Rundown houses, unkempt lawns, property values in the gutter. I transformed it. By stealing from your neighbors? By doing what was necessary, she hissed. Those fools wouldn't even approve a reasonable budget for basic improvements. I had to take matters into my own hands. And pocket the difference? She dismissed this with a wave. I was compensated for my vision and leadership. Without me, this entire neighborhood would still be a mess of mismatched fences and tacky lawn ornaments. That wasn't your decision to make. Especially not for properties like mine that were never legally part of your association. A calculating look crossed her face. About that. I did some research after our last encounter. That 1901 deed you're so proud of? The Newman estate? I know who they were. The sudden shift caught me off guard. What? The Newmans were land barons, ruthless ones at that. They fought against every community improvement project for decades. Roads, water systems, even the town's first public school, they opposed it all, claiming property rights while really just hoarding their wealth. I shook my head. I don't see how century-old politics are relevant to your fraudulent HOA. Don't you find it interesting? She continued as if I hadn't spoken. That you would end up purchasing this specific property? A Newman returning to the Newman estate after all these years? I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Newman. Before I could respond, a police cruiser pulled up behind Karen's Mercedes, followed by a county vehicle. Crystal emerged from the latter, accompanied by a uniformed officer. Karen glanced back at them, then turned to me with startling intensity. This isn't over. That property has been a thorn in this community's side for generations. If you think some old piece of paper will protect you, you're mistaken. As Crystal and the officer approached, Karen straightened her posture and adopted a more controlled expression. Karen Westfield? The officer called out. We need to speak with you regarding some financial discrepancies with the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association. What happened next would cement Karen's fate and reveal the true extent of her crimes, reaching far beyond simple financial fraud to a scheme that had affected property records throughout the county. I have nothing to hide, Karen declared, though her body language told a different story as she took a subtle step toward her car. All HOA finances are properly managed and documented. Then you won't mind explaining why we found nearly $850,000 in unexplained deposits to your personal account over the past 5 years? Crystal asked. Or why we discovered shredded HOA documents in your recycling bin this morning? The officer moved closer. Ms. Westfield, we'd like you to accompany us to the station to answer some questions. Karen's composure cracked. This is harassment. I've done nothing but improve this neighborhood while ungrateful residents complain about paying their fair share. Ma'am, the officer said more firmly, please turn around and place your hands behind your back. For a moment, I thought she might comply. Then, with surprising speed for a woman in her 50s wearing heeled boots, Karen bolted toward her car. She only made it 3 steps before the officer caught her arm. As he recited her rights and secured handcuffs around her wrists, Karen fixed me with a gaze of pure hatred. You have no idea what you've done, she said, her voice low and venomous. That house has been nothing but trouble for this community since it was built. Just like its original owner. Just like you. As they led her to the police cruiser, Crystal approached me. We found something at her house you should know about. A file labeled Newman Property contained historical documents she appears to have removed from county archives, including pages that should have been attached to your property's records but were deliberately separated decades ago. What kind of documents? Genealogical records, mostly. And a copy of a will from 1943 that references the restrictive covenant on your property. She hesitated. According to these records, you appear to be the great-grandson of the original owner, Jeremiah Newman. I stared at her in disbelief. That's impossible. I grew up in foster care. I don't know anything about my family history. The connection is through your father's line. There are birth certificates and adoption records in the file. It seems Karen has been researching your family tree extensively. Crystal looked troubled. The disturbing part is that these documents should have been in sealed county records or state archives. She shouldn't have had access to them. Why would she care about my family history? That's what we're trying to determine. But based on financial records we've recovered, there appears to be a significant trust fund associated with the Newman estate, one that requires a direct descendant of Jeremiah Newman to claim. My head was spinning. A family I never knew I had. A house I'd been drawn to without understanding why. And apparently, money that might legally be mine. How much are we talking about? The documents indicate the original sum was $50,000 in 1943. With compound interest over 80 years. She shrugged. It could be substantial. As the police cruiser carrying Karen pulled away, another vehicle arrived, an expensive black sedan that parked precisely at the curb. A tall man in a tailored suit emerged, his expression grim as he approached us. Ms. Saunders. He nodded at Crystal before turning to me. Mr. Newman, I presume? Maxwell Westfield, County Property Assessor. Karen's husband. Crystal explained to me, her tone noticeably cooler. Former husband. Maxwell corrected. We've been divorced for 3 years, though Karen continues to use my name professionally. Mr. Westfield was instrumental in bringing this case to our attention, Crystal added, surprising me. He contacted our office 6 months ago with concerns about irregularities in HOA filings. Maxwell's face remained impassive. I discovered discrepancies while handling a routine property assessment in Sycamore Heights. What began as professional concern became something more urgent when I realized the extent of the fraud. Why would your ex-wife's activities matter to you? I asked, suspicious of his convenient appearance. A flicker of emotion crossed his face before disappearing behind professional detachment. Karen's actions have harmed many innocent homeowners. But more importantly, her fraud extended to manipulating official county records, which falls under my department's jurisdiction. Crystal's phone buzzed. She checked it, then looked up with raised eyebrows. The forensic accountant just sent a preliminary report. It appears Karen has been systematically altering property records for at least 12 years, long before the HOA even existed officially. What does that mean exactly? I asked. It means, Maxwell answered, that she's been building a paper trail to support her HOA empire for over a decade. Inserting falsified documents into county files, removing restrictive covenants like the one protecting your property, and in some cases, completely fabricating property histories. Crystal nodded. The investigation is expanding beyond just HOA fraud. We're looking at numerous counts of forgery, record tampering, and identity theft. The signatures she forged to annex properties weren't limited to HOA documents, she altered actual deeds in some cases. I thought about the mysterious file Karen had kept on my family history. Do you think my property was specifically targeted? She seemed to know a lot about the original Newman family. Maxwell and Crystal exchanged glances. That's where this gets more complicated, Maxwell said. Karen has been obsessed with your property for years. Long before you purchased it. Why? Because, Maxwell replied carefully, according to records I've reviewed, the trust fund associated with the Newman estate isn't just substantial, it's worth approximately $28 million today. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. $28 million? It seemed impossible. And, he continued, Karen believed she had a legitimate claim to it through her maternal grandmother, who she thought was also descended from Jeremiah Newman. Crystal picked up the thread. But when she researched the family line, she discovered her grandmother was actually from a different Newman family entirely, no relation. She's been trying to find ways to control the property ever since, apparently believing that possession of the house might somehow strengthen a claim to the trust. Which is legally baseless, Maxwell added. The trust stipulations are quite clear. Only a direct blood descendant of Jeremiah Newman can claim it. And according to the documents Karen acquired, that would be you, Mr. Newman. I sank down onto my porch steps, overwhelmed. From homeless foster kid to Army veteran to small business owner, and now, potentially, a millionaire with an ancestral home I'd purchased through what I'd thought was random chance. We'll need to verify everything, of course, Crystal said. But the preliminary evidence is compelling. The trust has been managed by First National Bank since its establishment, with the stipulation that it would await a legitimate Newman heir. And Karen knew all this? She was trying to claim my family's money? Maxwell's expression darkened. I believe that was her end goal, yes. By controlling your property through the HOA, she likely hoped to establish some form of legal connection that her attorneys could leverage. As we continued talking, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, curious about the police activity. Patrick approached cautiously, followed by several others I recognized from Karen's meeting the night before. Is it true? Patrick asked. Was the HOA fraudulent? Crystal addressed the growing crowd professionally. The Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association appears to have been operating under irregular circumstances. We're investigating allegations of financial impropriety and documentation fraud. If you've been paying HOA fees and believe your property may have been improperly annexed, please contact our office to file a formal statement. The revelation of Karen's schemes spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, bringing with it a mix of anger, relief, and in some cases, vindication for those who had questioned her authority for years. But for me, the most profound revelation wasn't about Karen's crimes or even the unexpected fortune waiting to be claimed. It was the dawning realization that after a lifetime of having no roots, no family history, I had unwittingly found my way home, to a house built by my own great-great-grandfather, protected through generations by a covenant he had created specifically to preserve his family's independence. As Maxwell provided me with contact information for the bank that managed the trust, and Crystal assured me that the county would restore the proper historical records to my properties file, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of belonging I'd never experienced before. The story should have ended there, with Karen in custody and the truth revealed. But 3 days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at my door, bringing with her the final piece of the puzzle, and a challenge that would test exactly what kind of Newman I truly was. The knock came just after sunset. I opened the door to find an elderly woman I'd never seen before, supported by a younger man who bore a striking resemblance to Karen. Mr. Newman? The woman asked, her voice strong despite her evident frailty. I'm Eleanor Westfield, Karen's mother. This is my grandson Daniel. Surprised, I invited them in, noting how Eleanor's sharp eyes took in every detail of the house as she entered. I won't waste your time with pleasantries, she said once seated in my living room. I've come about the trust fund and this property. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Grandmother, we agreed to approach this delicately. She waved away his concern. At my age, delicacy is a luxury I can't afford. Mr. Newman deserves honesty. I appreciate that, I said. What about the trust fund? Eleanor fixed me with an unwavering gaze. Karen's obsession with your family's money didn't originate with her. It began with me. She reached into her handbag and withdrew an old photograph that showed a young woman standing next to a man in a military uniform. That's me in 1952, she explained. And that's William Newman, Jeremiah's grandson and your grandfather. We were engaged to be married. I stared at the photo, seeing hints of my own features in the young soldier's face. What happened? War happened. Korea. William was shipped out, and while he was gone, I discovered I was pregnant. Eleanor's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly. In those days, an unmarried pregnant woman faced terrible stigma. My parents sent me away to have the child in secret. Daniel took up the story. My mother, Karen's mother, was born in a home for unwed mothers and immediately given up for adoption. I never told William. Eleanor continued. He was fighting a war and I was a coward. By the time he returned, I had married someone else out of shame and desperation. Your grandfather never knew he had a daughter. The implications of her story began to dawn on me. Are you saying Karen is your first cousin, once removed? Eleanor confirmed. Which means the trust fund Karen has been so desperate to claim, she actually did have a legitimate right to a portion of it. As a descendant of Jeremiah Newman through William's daughter. I sat back, stunned. Does Karen know this? Not entirely, Daniel said. Mother discovered our connection to the Newmans through genealogical research, but she never knew the full story of grandmother's relationship with William. She believed her claim was through a more distant connection. Eleanor leaned forward. I'm not here to defend what Karen did. Her methods were inexcusable, criminal even. But I wanted you to understand that her fixation on this property wasn't merely greed. It was also a distorted attempt to claim a family legacy she sensed was rightfully hers, even if she couldn't prove it. Why tell me this now? I asked. Because, Eleanor said simply, your family. The only blood relative my daughter and grandson have left on the Newman side. And despite Karen's crimes, I couldn't bear the thought of you never knowing the truth. Daniel pulled some papers from a folder. We've brought documentation, birth certificates, adoption records, DNA test results from an ancestry service I used years ago. Everything you need to verify our story. As I examined the documents, another realization struck me. If Karen is truly descended from Jeremiah Newman, then legally, she might have a claim to a share of the trust. That's not why we're here, Eleanor insisted. We don't want your money. Karen made her choices and must face the consequences. I simply wanted you to know your family history, all of it, not just the parts Karen pieced together for her own purposes. Daniel nodded in agreement. Grandmother insisted on coming even though her doctors advised against it. This was important to her. I studied Eleanor's face, seeing echoes of the young woman in the photograph who had once loved my grandfather. Despite everything Karen had done, I couldn't help feeling a connection to these people, these relatives I never knew existed. What will happen to Karen? I asked. She's facing serious charges, Daniel replied. Multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, document tampering. Her attorney is pushing for a plea deal, but even best-case scenario, she's looking at significant prison time. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I failed her as a mother. Perhaps if I'd been honest about her heritage from the beginning, she wouldn't have developed this obsession with claiming what she sensed was her birthright. We talked for hours, filling in gaps in each other's understanding of our shared family history. Daniel showed me photos of Karen as a young woman, bright, ambitious, and by all accounts, initially well-intentioned in her desire to improve the neighborhood. The HOA started legitimately, he explained. But when she discovered the potential connection to the Newman Trust, something changed. She became fixated on controlling your property specifically. The fraud expanded from there. By the time Eleanor and Daniel prepared to leave, I had reached a decision. The trust fund stipulates that it goes to Jeremiah Newman's direct descendants, I said. Based on these documents, that includes Karen, and you, Daniel. Regardless of what Karen did, I intend to ensure you both receive your rightful shares. Eleanor shook her head firmly. That's very generous, but no. Karen made her bed. As for Daniel, I don't want the money, Daniel interrupted. Not after what my mother did to get it. But there is one thing I'd like to ask. What's that? The historical documents about the Newman family that my mother collected. They belong here, with this house and with you. Once the investigation is complete and they're released, would you accept them? They're your heritage as much as they are ours. I agreed readily, touched by the gesture. After they left, I stood on my front porch, looking at the house with new eyes, not just as a property I'd purchased but as a legacy that had somehow found its way back to me. And despite the turmoil of recent days, I felt a profound sense of peace. The following week brought closure on multiple fronts. Karen accepted a plea deal, confessing to multiple felonies in exchange for a reduced sentence of 8 years. The county completed its investigation, officially nullifying all fraudulent HOA annexations and restoring the original property records. And most significantly, First National Bank verified my identity as Jeremiah Newman's great-grandson, acknowledging my claim to the trust that had grown to nearly $30 million over the decades. True to my word, I ensured that legal provisions were made to recognize Daniel's claim to his share once Karen had served her sentence, and made restitution to the homeowners she had defrauded. The neighborhood, freed from Karen's tyrannical HOA, began to form a voluntary community association, one focused on genuine cooperation rather than control. Many residents, including Patrick, approached me about joining, but they all respected my decision to maintain my property's historic independence. 6 months after Karen's arrest, as I stood in my front yard surveying recent landscaping improvements, Crystal Saunders stopped by with a final update. "The investigation is officially closed," she reported. "All affected homeowners have been notified that they were never legally part of the HOA and are entitled to refunds of improperly collected fees." "That's good news," I said. "How many properties were involved?" 72 homes were fraudulently annexed over 12 years. The legitimate Sycamore Heights HOA actually only covered 26 properties on the far side of the neighborhood. She hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing you should know. We found evidence that Karen had attempted to forge your signature on documents that would have transferred partial ownership of this property to her HOA corporation. If she hadn't been caught when she was, she might have succeeded in her scheme," I finished. Crystal nodded. The elaborate nature of her fraud was quite extraordinary. In a twisted way, it's almost impressive how methodical she was. As Crystal prepared to leave, she paused. "What will you do with the trust money? $30 million is a life-changing amount." I smiled. "I've already started. There's a new Veterans Housing Initiative breaking ground next month. And I've established a scholarship fund for foster kids aging out of the system." "That's commendable," she said. "Your great-great-grandfather would be proud." Looking up at the house that had brought me full circle to a family I never knew I had, I felt a deep certainty that she was right. Jeremiah Newman had built this home and established the trust not just to preserve wealth but to ensure that future generations would have the freedom to chart their own course. And now, through a century of separation and a twist of fate that had brought me back to where it all began, I finally understood the true meaning of the covenant he had so carefully inscribed in that 1901 deed, not just independence from community governance, but the freedom to choose what kind of community we create for ourselves and for those who will come after us. Karen had tried to build her empire on control and deception. I would build something different, a legacy of connection and generosity that honored the Newman name in a way no HOA could ever comprehend.